Alright everybody, welcome back to another Ask a Dev Unreal Engine Blueprint tutorial. We are working with UI. So far, we've talked about our layouts, we've talked about making our mouse cursor and all of our UI elements interactable. We've talked about our UI elements as variables, some style, some material stuff. But now today, we're going to talk about widgets within widgets, because we need a way to efficiently reuse our UI pieces just like we do with anything else in Unreal Engine. We want to maximize inheritance, we want to maximize our flexibility and reduce the amount of work. So we are going to be talking about taking all that we've learned about buttons and everything so far and making those widgets that we then reuse in other widgets. My name's Kevin. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel, all of our Patreon members, and everybody who takes time to leave feedback. It's always helpful. As always, if you have thoughts on what we're doing, throw your feedback in the comments down below. Also, don't forget to check out the live section. That's where most of our tutorials are, because we do live tutorials each week. With that, let's get started. We're going to hop straight back into Unreal. A little bit of where we left off. If you recall, we have our menu and we also have our buttons now that have style to them based on our images. But what we want to talk about specifically is the fact that if I want to change any of these hello, goodbye, jump, or whatever buttons I've created, if I was going to change the style, let's say I decided that my UI was too dark, all right, or too light in this case. It's too light. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to open up our hello button. Let me zoom in a little bit here, and also let me update our sizing so you all can read this a little bit better today. Okay, so if I was going to hop in and I was going to update this hello button because I realized everything's a little bit too bright, I'm going to darken that down. When I do that, that's going to be a little bit easier to look at for me. Perfect. And then I'm thinking, you know what? I think the hello also needs to be, rather than being black, let's just go white, for example. Now, you can see I've made this change to that button. I've updated the style. This is what I want. I now have to go back and redo this for every single button I've created. That is insane. We do not have time to do that, and there's no reason we should want to do that. It would be a lot cooler if we had one button that we could update and it just updated everything. Through the power of inheritance and all those things, we can do exactly that, and that's why we're going to create a widget inside of a widget. So let's do that. So over here in our tutorial directory, I'm going to go into UI and I'm going to create a new user interface widget blueprint, and I am going to call this our widget blueprint, and this is going to be our button base, for example. And what we're going to do is we're going to recreate our hello button inside button base. So let's just do that really simply. And all we need in here is an image. Let's drop in an image. Where is it? Here's our image. And then let's drop in our text. Actually, we need this to be a button. We're going to make this a button. So before we do this, let's grab, we do need something to wrap this in. So let's just try, we're going to start with an overlay, and then let's go ahead and bring in our button. And then inside of our button, we know that we need text. All right, so this is kind of the baseline for what it is we're doing. And what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that our button expands to the full extent, and our text should be kind of as is. I'm going to set my default size for my button to be something a little more reasonable. In this case, these are, what is the size of this? This is about 300 wide. Let's just try 200. So rather than filling the screen, I'm just going to go custom. So this is going to show me more the size of what this is going to look like on screen. Okay, that's reasonable. Let's take our text block and let's make our font a little bit bigger. Let's go 36. That's good. And then let's change our style slightly, and let's bring back all the work we did for our textures. So to do that, if we just grab our tutorial square texture that we did previously, I can click on that over here on the right, And then what I'm going to do is find that so I don't have to hunt for it. I'm going to go back to our new button base blueprint, and I am going to change the style of the button itself to be this image. Now when I do that, just like what happened in our last tutorial, we need to change our drawing settings, and I'm going to be using the box setting so that we get our nice borders. Okay. Now it's a little bit tough to see just because it is so dark. And that is why we made this a material instance. So let's go here and let's lighten this up a little bit. Let's change our fill color to be something a little bit more readable, especially for the purpose of the tutorial. And maybe we can go with a nice brighter blue for our borders. Maybe something like that, something a little bit more steel. That's great. We'll save that. We'll go back to our button base. And now we have kind of our lighter color with our font text block. And we have successfully created a new widget that is our button base. Now there's going to be a couple things that we need to do here in order to make all of this work. So first things first, we have our hello button. And if you recall from previous tutorials, we set up our hello button as a variable so that when we click on hello, which is our button A, we print hello. And we're setting the color and opacity of the text. So if we just recap how that works right now, because this is what we want to recreate. If we press play, bring up my menu, and I press hello, it changes the hello text. I press goodbye, it changes goodbye text. Okay, so we just want to recreate that with our new buttons. So let's do that. So if we go back to designer, what I'm going to do initially is let's just start by deleting a bunch of these buttons down here. And we'll even delete this one. We'll keep our box. Now, this is where we actually get into using a widget inside of a widget. So we have our debug menu widget, and I want to use that new button that we just created as a base. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to, in our palette, we're going to type in button. And you'll notice that when I type in button, you'll notice that other widgets show up now, which is awesome. So here I can choose button base. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop button base into our vertical box. Look at that. Our button base just showed up. That's perfect. Now, let's go ahead and duplicate this 3 times because we want to basically replace hello, goodbye, and jump. And we're going to replace it with our 3 button bases. Now you'll notice that we do have a couple of challenges with us. If I want to change the text of the button base, I have to do a little bit more work. But once I do it once, it'll work for everything. So right now, there's no way for me to set the value of this text block. And that is because the button base is being created inside of our debug menu. And there's no way to tell the button base how to update its text. So let's go back to our button base and give ourselves a way to customize these so they could say hello, goodbye, and jump. Sweet. Here we go. Back to button base. Now, as we did in previous tutorials, we are going to use the fact that we can take all of these components of our UI and convert them to variables. And we're going to do the same thing with our text block. So I'm going to change this text block, and I'm going to change this to a variable. I'm going to call this text. Let's call it default. Okay. So then once we have that variable, when I go over to my graph, what I can do is on construct, what I can do is I can take the text default and I can set the text value. Just like we did with the hello tutorial. And what we can do is we can set the text value to default here, for example, as an example. And if I compile this, I'm going to save this as well, just because crashes are always a thing. When we compile this and save this, when we press play and we press M, you'll notice that all my text says default. And that's because what's happening is our debug menu is taking text block. It's going inside of our widget blueprint button base. And in the construct node, it's calling set the text to default. Now, what we could do is we could actually do this in the pre-construct instead. And if we compile this, when we go back to designer, you'll notice that it says default, and you'll notice that it says default now in my view. So I can actually see what it's doing. So if you do it in pre-construct, it will show up here in the UI. If you just do it in construct, it'll happen before it gets constructed in the actual engine when the actual widget blueprint gets constructed. I'm going to keep it in pre-construct because I want to see the values of my buttons in the UI. So we have one more thing to do. You'll notice that these all say default. I need a way to change this to be hello, goodbye, and jump. All right, so if we go back to our button base, what we're going to do is now, in addition to having a variable for the component, we're going to create another variable for the text value. So let's go to our graph. I can get rid of this construct script. Let's just clean this up a little bit. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this value, this text value, I'm going to right click on this pen and I'm going to promote this to a variable. All right, and the variable is the text. Now, in order for, if we compile and save this, you'll notice that if I go to my debug menu and I click on default, there's no text for me to set. I can't access that variable. That's because we do need to make sure that our variable is instance editable and exposed on spawn. Our default is already default. Now, when I compile this and save it, when we go back to the debug menu and we look at our text blocks and we click on a button, you'll notice I now have a variable here called text. If I change the value of this text field, it is going to update my button. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to type in hello. When we do that, we now have a hello button. Cool. All right. So now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to change this to goodbye. Goodbye. And finally, we have our jump. So what is happening is we have a widget inside of our widget. This button is getting pulled in. When this button gets pulled into our menu, it goes out to the button and it says, what does it look like visually? That's great. I'm going to pull all that in. And then in addition, I am going to, in the pre-construct, set it up so that the user, the designer, the developer, whoever, can set the text, and I'm going to set the text in the pre-construct. All right, this is just covering all the visuals. So now that I have that, it is very easy for me to quickly update each of these buttons to have whatever custom font I want. So now you're thinking, okay, that's great, but how do we connect them to different events? That's the cool thing. Because these are instances of a button base, just like a button base, you'll notice that each of these has been automatically set to a variable in the top right over here. All we're going to do is I'm going to rename these to be button new hello. Ideally, I wouldn't do this, but just to be clear, I'm going to call this one button new goodbye, bye, and button new jump. Button new jump. Just because we already have buttons, I'm guessing if I name them, oh, actually I called them button A, B, and C. I could just call them button hello. Let's do that. We don't need the new. Okay, so we have button hello, button bye, and button jump. And just like we did with our other buttons, what we can do if we compile and save this, if we go to the graph, you'll notice that we have our three events. If you recall, button A was hello. If I pick button hello and I add an event, you'll notice we do not have OnClick. And that's because even though our widget button base is a widget with a button in it, Unreal doesn't know that the whole thing is meant to be a button. So there's two ways that we could potentially solve this issue. One is we could tell Unreal that this is a button, which we could do in C++, for example. We could actually create our own button class that inherits from button base, or because we're not going to go crazy with C++, we are actually going to go back to our button base and we are going to use a dispatcher to help us. So first things first, this thing being called button 265 is driving me nuts. So let's just go back and rename this to be button main. Okay. Now if we go back to our graph, we now have button main. What I want to do is I want to be able to trigger this OnClick event. So in order to call the OnClick event effectively, but from our widget that we're using these buttons in, what we need to do is we need to create a dispatcher. So I'm going to create a dispatcher, and I'm going to call this event dispatch. I'm just going to call this dispatcher, e-dispatcher for short, or e-dispatch for short is fine. And I'm going to call this OnClicked. All right. And then what we're going to do is we're simply going to connect it in. So let's just call this whenever we click the button. So here's what's going to happen. If somebody is using our reusable button all around their UIs, when you click that button, what happens is it calls this dispatcher. This dispatcher we can now use back in our debug menu. So let's compile and save this. Let's go back, and you'll notice that if we click on our button hello, compile just in case, we scroll down, you'll notice I now have under events, I have an event dispatcher OnClicked. If I just go ahead and add this to our blueprint and we move this up here by our hello, what I can do is I can connect this straight into hello. So we're just simply creating a dispatcher that I can now call basically from within our button. What's going to happen is our button base, when it's clicked, is going to call whatever dispatcher has been assigned, and the dispatcher that we've assigned is here. So if we compile this and save it, when we press play now, what you'll notice is if we bring up our menu, if we press hello, our text should turn green. It does. So now we have a quick way to basically rebuild all of the tech from these previous buttons, and we'll be able to wrap up this tutorial. So we have our event dispatcher for the button hello. That's great. We can now get rid of our button A because we are going to be deleting that, and we are going to do the same thing for the others. So pick goodbye, scroll down, and we should have our dispatcher for goodbye, and that is going to be our button B. We'll disconnect our previous OnClick, and we're going to, while we're here, we're just going to do the same thing for jump. So let's create a dispatcher on, call our dispatcher event for the jump, which was button C, and we will compile all of that and save it. And then let's go back to our designer, and we can get rid of leap of faith. Let's get rid of button A, button B, and button C. So now we just have our text box. We have our new buttons, hello, goodbye, and jump. If we compile and save this and we run, we should have the exact same functionality we had before, but this time what we have is we have a reusable button. So if I click hello, it should print hello, goodbye prints goodbye, and jump causes our character to jump. And what's cool about this is now if I decide that I do not like the colors of these items or these buttons, what I can just do is, let's say my art director comes down and says, you know what, all the buttons are too dark or they're too light. I need you to brighten them up or lighten them up or whatever it is. I'm going to come in here, I'm going to come into my button main, and I am going to update my material, for example. So let's just update this source material, and let's make this even darker for the background. And let's just say that the border color, we're going to make a little bit more of a, here we go, something a little bit easier, more of a dark tone. When we save this, this is going to update my button base. Difficult to see, but you can see it. And then let's just say that we want to change the font. Font's too blocky, font's whatever it is. When I change this font, if I come down here in appearance, I choose font rather than Roboto, let's just do Droid, for example. When I compile this, rather than having to update every button in every UI all throughout my game or experience, when I go back to my debug menu, you'll notice that all of that has updated. And you can actually see if I just make this a window in a window. Oops. Let me make this a little bit, things are getting crazy. Okay, if I make this over here, what we can do is I can update the fonts on the fly, and you'll see the change happen. So unfortunately I only have three fonts hooked up here, but you can see when I compile this will update, and I can change the color to be something a little bit more gray. I compile that, you'll see that it updates. Maybe we want a little bit more blue to it, a little bit more of the color that we have for our borders. We can compile that, and there you go. So this is a quick way to create a reusable button. That way we don't have to change everything everywhere. Now, if you have questions on dispatchers, that is totally understandable. I have a separate video on dispatchers that you can check out, but the overall point is all you're doing is you're telling your UI buttons that when you get clicked to call whatever has been defined for that particular dispatcher. And that is why in our graph, you'll notice that we are using the call dispatched OnClick, so that inside of our graph, we are literally just making use of that dispatcher. It's a way for us to communicate between the two widgets about what is being clicked. Now, in a similar fashion, if we wanted to do this exact same type of logic of widgets inside of widgets, but we wanted to do it for something like an inventory item, that is also a fantastic use case for widgets inside of widgets. What do I mean by that? Let's go back to our designer and let's pretend very quickly, because I don't want this to get too long-winded, very quickly that this was also our inventory UI. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in here a uniform grid, and I'm going to drop this underneath our overlay, and inside of our uniform grid I am going to drop in a couple images as placeholders. Alright, and we'll duplicate these. When we're going to make our grid 4x4, over here the way uniform grid works, we have row column, so this is 0 0, that's fine. Right now everything's 0 0, we're going to go 0 1, and then we'll go 1 0, and then we'll go 1 1. Okay, so we have a uniform grid in the top left. Let's put some padding between these just so that we can tell them apart. And these would represent potentially our inventory items. However, we don't want to stick our inventory, we don't want to create individual inventory tiles. What we want to create is a new widget class, and we're going to call this widget user widget, and this is going to be our widget blueprint, and this is going to be inventory tile. Our inventory tile, if we were going to make this very quickly, is something that we want to have and make reusable. We can get rid of our hover, and all it's going to be, let's use a little bit of our UI understanding. We're going to do a couple things here. Let's drop in let's just keep it simple. Let's use a vertical box. And the reason I'm going to do this, and I may change this as we go, but we're going to drop in a vertical box. The top of the box is going to be the name of our item. The middle of the box is going to be an image that represents the item. And then the next level down is going to be, for example, the quantity. Let's keep this simple. So we're going to name all of these just to be consistent. This is going to be text name. The bottom one is going to be text quantity, for example. And this image is going to be the image for the thumbnail. Alrighty. Now what we're going to do is we are going to make it so that, let's just go ahead and rather than fill screen, we're going to go with custom, and let's assume that our inventory tiles are, let's try 64 by 64 on the images. We're going to go 64 by 64. Let's zoom in here. Okay, we're going to do a little bit of formatting, and what we're going to do is we're going to center our thumbnail. Let's see here, auto. Okay. Oh, I see. Our text, our vertical box is too short. Let's go 128. It's because of basically because of our font size. It's too big. So let's say this thing could be 256 wide. Nah, that's too much. 128. And then let's reduce the size of our text. Let's go down to 14. That's a little bit more reasonable. For example, we'll go 14, and then we'll center all of this stuff. We can get rid of this overlay. So if we right click on this, we can replace this with the child. And then this is centered. Let's center our text as well. And we'll center our quantity as well. Okay, so everything's kind of centered within this widget. Currently, we should probably make these 128 by 128 just for consistency. And we need to do the same things that we did with our button. We need to be able to make it so that we can set these values. So on our construct, what we're going to do, or on our pre-construct, what we're going to do is we are going to, in our designer, first we need to make our text variables. Both of these need to be variables, as well as our image also needs to be variable, which it is. And then what we'll do is we'll set our text to whatever value we pass in for the name, and we can call the default. We'll set our default here in a second, and we can set our quantity. We'll set the text on that. And then what we can do is we can get our thumbnail, and this one we're going to set the brush. And we need to make a brush. Make a brush from, let's do it from texture. And the texture we're going to pass in, we're going to make this a variable, but by default, let's just use this, for example. Let's connect this in. Let's promote this to a variable. We'll promote this to a variable. And we're going to rename these to be item name, item quantity, quantity, and this one we would press in promote to variable, and we could call this item thumbnail. All right, if we compile that, this is in our pre-construct. If we go to our designer, you can see we have our sizing and everything. Our thumbnail is a little bit big. Let's knock this down to 64 by 64. Okay, and then we do need to change our default text. So let's just change the default for item name to be name, and the default for quantity to be 99, for example. When we compile this, we look at our designer. This is what our image basically looks like. Currently it is resizing, which it's resizing to be the size of this texture. So let's try forcing this to be set the desired size, override, and we're just going to force this to be 64 by 64. Let's compile that and see. There we go. So we have a nice tile now. What we've done is we've set up a widget for our inventory tile, and we've made it so that the name and the quantity and the image are all variables that we can set, just like we did with our button. This is all about widgets and reusing stuff. Okay, we did miss three things. Well, it's one thing three ways. So one thing we forgot to do with our item name is we forgot to set it to instance editable and expose on spawn. Same thing with the quantity, because if we don't do this, we're not going to be able to change it. Actually, this may not be the right type. We may not be able to change this thumbnail. We're going to come back to the thumbnail. Let's just get this going first, make sure all of this stuff works. So now, instead of having 4 little images in here, let's make a couple changes to our uniform grid. If you recall, our actual size for our inventory tiles, if we were making an inventory interface, was 128. So let's go 128 by 128. This is going to make this a lot bigger. Then rather than putting in images, what we're going to drop in is we're going to drop in our new inventory tile. So I can just type up in here inventory tile, and I can just drag this to our uniform grid. And you'll notice that it pops in. So let's go ahead and duplicate this 4 times, and we'll do the same thing. We're going to set the locations by setting the columns and the rows they're in. So now we have 4 inventory items. And what we would do is when we open the UI, we would check the user's inventory, and when we check the user's inventory, all we're going to do is update these values. So currently the name is, maybe you have a sword and you have 1 of them, and then you have a shield and you have 1 of them, and then you have, let's say, a health pot, and you have 3 of them, and then finally you have a, what do you think, bracer? You have a hat, and you have 1 hat, or no, come on, let's go helm. You have a helm, you have 1 helm. So now what's going to happen is you can see we're setting all of the values of each of these items within the inventory grid, and we're reusing it. So when we go back and make changes, if we need to change the font or anything on our inventory tile, we're basically reusing it. Now, we did have one slight problem with our texture. We can't, yes we can. We can change this, we need to change the item thumbnail to instance, editable, and exposed on spawn. And what this is going to do is this is going to give us the power over here to change. You can see here, we can change our item thumbnail now. So let's just use the green happy face, and then we'll change this one to be the little red devil dude, bullseye, and our spawn point. Or let's see, we'll make the helm. Let's make the helm this Android icon. Okay. So very quickly, if we play now, you'll notice that when we bring up our menu, we have in the top left, we have our inventory. And their inventory is set up so that I can make it customizable. Now, I set it by hand, but you can do that within your blueprint. Whenever you open this UI, what you would do is you would get your grid and you would check your inventory, and for however many items you have, you would just add one of these widgets to your grid, for example. And the cool thing about this is if I want to go back to my inventory tile, for example, and I want to make it so that this entire thing is slightly different. And what do I mean by slightly different? Let's just say that I want there to be an outline around the whole thing, so it's clear what's what. I can right click my vertical box now. I can wrap this with a border, for example. The border currently is pure white. I am going to change it so that the brush, let's go 1, and let's change the color to be dark blue, for example, and we're going to draw this as a border instead, and our width is going to be, let's try a margin of 4. There it is. Okay, so the way the border works is, oh my goodness, man, it's so many things to keep track of as we're doing this. So in order to get the border to draw as a border, what we need to do is we need to set it to border and then give it the margins that we want. So in this case, I'm going to go 0.2. I get a pretty thick border. I'm going to go 0.1. So when I do that, and this is also kind of tied into the styling video we did last time. But anyways, point is, it turns out for this to actually draw as a border, if you want it to, you need to actually change you need to have some kind of image filled in here, and then it will draw as a blue border for you. The point here though is when I compile and I go back to my debug menu, you'll notice that I actually have all of the borders set here. Now, interestingly enough, they're not scaling to the right size. So we want to make sure that inside of, I believe, each of our inventory tiles, we can make them all, make sure they stretch to the full size, top to bottom. That way we get the full squares that we're expecting. And if we press play, you'll notice that we have each of our items here in the top left corner with a border now. Now, a little bit of a formatting thing that's kind of gonna bug me a little bit. Our vertical box is sized to fit. Let's make sure this is fill. See if that helps us. There we go. At least it's centered now. All right, but you'll be able to play with the formatting of this based on what it is you're creating and how big it is. In this particular case, we're zoomed in. We're 128 by 128, and in here our uniform grid panels are 128 by 128 with a slot padding of 5. We could probably reduce our slot padding, etc. But do not get lost in this. The whole point of this is to know that you can create a widget and then you can reuse that widget inside of another widget to save yourself time so that you're not updating 5 different buttons when all you want to do is change a baseline color. So that wraps up our tutorial for today. Widgets inside widgets are super powerful. They help reduce the amount of extra editing and work that you need to do. I wanted to make sure we covered a little bit, or at least a couple of speed bumps that you would hit along the way so that you can just power through those. As always, throw your comments down below. If you want, show your support. We have the Patreon, we have the super chats and stickers. Drop in the Discord server where we answer questions there all the time. We're just generally hanging out, excited about making stuff in Unreal Engine. You know how this stuff works. Also help spread the word about what we're doing. My name's Kevin. I hope to see you in an upcoming live stream. Check out the YouTube channel for schedules on when the next one is. Generally speaking, we do those once a week, usually on Wednesdays. So take it easy. Thanks for watching.